In this presentation, we will look at responding to human observations. Let's look in more detail at what makes the difference between observations. If an inspector makes an exceeds expectation observation, they have probably seen a situation where there are healthy performance-influencing factors, or PIFs, that would make the task very reliable. As expected observations are most common and suggest a task which was executed okay on the day, and there didn't seem to be any healthy or unhealthy PIFs to affect the task reliability. A largely as expected suggests the inspector has seen unhealthy PIFs that could potentially impact the reliability of the task, but probably didn't affect the critical aspect. For example, there may be a procedure that's a bit unhelpful and bulky, but when it comes to the critical step, it's very clear. This type of response tells you there are opportunities to improve something that could cause problems in the future. Finally, if the execution of a task is not as expected, the inspector has seen issues or PIFs that make mistakes more likely or don't support the task. Then we have an opportunity to make the PIFs healthy, to make the task successful and strengthen the barrier. There is no strict rule for how many PIFs would trigger a not as expected, or how well the task has to be executed to warrant an exceeds, but there are some things you can bear in mind. The inspector knows that the person they are observing is just the tip of the iceberg of the conditions that will ensure a task gets done reliably. They are looking for evidence that these conditions are there to help people be successful in the task. As expected is the most likely response for most tasks. As long as the task does what it's intended to do, it might warrant an as expected. The task may have been demonstrated or explained by someone, and it meets the intent of the requirements, even if there is the odd bit or detail missing here or there. In our galley example, the task to check and change the ventilation filters was being done, even if not everybody knew what was required. In the same example, the galley assistant was able to show how to extinguish a pan fire with a blanket, even though there was a reminder from the inspector to keep the face clear. In both occasions, that task was being done and there were no particular issues. Of course, everybody wants to exceed. Exceeding means that the task is being done, but there's also evidence that there are systematic reasons why it is very effective and reliable. Maybe the galley crew exceed expectations. Maybe they tell the inspector that anybody can use any extinguisher method, and they have a monthly stand-down to practice a variety of techniques. They talk about a weekly sweep of the kitchen, checking that fire doors aren't lashed in the open position or fire extinguishers aren't blocked with cleaning gear. Or maybe they describe a condition they weren't happy with, which was acted on by the company. There is evidence of systematic reasons for the tasks and the kitchen being in excellent condition. If a task is not as expected, it primarily means that the task isn't working, or there is something which makes the task unreliable. In our satellite positioning system example, we saw that the officer was very well versed in the ECDIS operation, but the verification of the satellite positioning wasn't being done. This was not necessarily an issue with the officer. They were under the impression that verification is only needed when there's a problem, but there is some uncertainty in the guidance from the company. On a largely as expected, the task is probably executed okay, but there are some PIFs that could cause problems in the future. Let's say that the officer does do verification, but the frequency is inconsistent, and the procedure is unhelpful about method and frequency. An inspector might decide that the task is carried out acceptably, but with a different officer or different circumstance in the future, maybe it would fall through the gaps. Across the SIRE 2.0 program, we expect the majority of human observations will be positive, falling into the as expected and exceeds category. Where largely as expected or not as expected observations are made, they are usually opportunities to improve the system to support people. Trials of the inspection support this, and here we see some of the many observations made in the exceeds and as expected categories during trials. So, what will be in the report? Well, here's an extract from an example report. The report's going to identify whether the performance of a task was as expected or in fact exceeded expectations. Or maybe that there are some opportunities to improve so that the task was largely as expected. Or maybe that the task didn't meet expectations and that there are some unhealthy performance influencing factors or PIFs that will need to be addressed to make the task reliable. One thing to keep in mind when interpreting the report is that we are always looking at the system, not the individuals involved, so the language will be deliberately neutral and objective when recording the observation. In particular, the inspectors will not name individuals, but may use the term observed person or OP or RT for responsible team to describe the observation that they made of the people performing a task. They may note the rank grouping of the observed person. Group rankings: Senior Deck Officer, Junior Deck Officer, Senior Engineer Officer, including ETOs, cargo engineers, and electricians based on company rank. Junior Engineer Officer, including ETOs, cargo engineers, and electricians based on company rank. Rating: Deck Team Task, historical task only. Engine Room Team Task, historical task only. Most importantly, there is an opportunity for the operator or vessel owner to respond to an observation to show how they have examined the issues and taken actions to address unhealthy PIFs. How you respond to the observations really matters. You have an opportunity to show how you are strengthening barriers by learning from the information you're getting from the inspection. How you respond to human factor observations influences your relationship with the crew. We need to avoid blame and understand context. What was making a task difficult to execute? How can you turn unhealthy PIFs into healthy PIFs that support execution? SIRE 2.0 is about supporting vessels' crews to be successful. So we need to assume the crew were doing their best in the conditions and avoid blaming or jumping to discipline as our response. Remember class as a guide to your response. Choose to learn, not blame. Blame can lead us to be blind to the real issues and stop people speaking up about problems. Learn from those who do the work. Next, let's remember that people know the most about their work and the issues that make mistakes more likely but might not be able to explain them. Even though the inspector has given you some information, there's probably more you can learn. Address PIFs. Turning unhealthy ones healthy and adding healthy PIFs to make a task more reliable. Systematic action across fleet. Systematic means trying to take actions that are sustainable and taking action to prevent, detect, and recover from error. Share feedback with the crew. Finally, it's important to close the loop and give people on the vessel feedback on what has changed and recognize their contribution to identifying and fixing issues. Blaming is a very instinctive action. Think of a time when someone else made a mistake. What did you think caused it? Think of a time when you made a mistake. What did you think caused it? Chances are, in the first case, you blamed the mistake on personal characteristic. They were stupid, careless, not paying attention, accident-prone, untrustworthy. And in the second case, you thought more about the context you were in, rushed, too much to do, etc. We are at the center of our own universe. When we judge our own actions or decisions, we feel how dynamic and fast things are, what little information there is, how the context pressurizes us. When we judge others' actions or decisions, we assume they are due to individual characteristics, personality traits, some flaw. We avoid this by not jumping to blame and focusing our efforts on the context, PIFs, in which people are acting. In fact, focusing on the task and the PIFs allows us to be more objective because they are things that we can see evidence for. We don't have to make a subjective judgment about the person. Learning happens when the workforce feels they can speak up about the problems that they're facing and trust that when they do, their suggestions will be listened to and reacted to in the right manner, and that they won't be blamed for raising issues. When we reduce blame, we increase trust between the workforce and leaders. There is good evidence to support the relationship between trust and safety performance. This research shows that as trust and respect increases between the workforce and the leadership, performance improves. and you see the number of incidents for both process and personal safety reduces. The opposite is also true. When there is low trust or respect between the workforce and leaders, we see increasing incidents. We know that blame gets in the way of learning, so we avoid making this about individuals. We are identifying the conditions that could trip anyone up at any time. We also work to build trust. Management and officers can go a long way to build trust by being visible on vessels and talking to vessel crews about the things that make their work hard to do. Being systematic when we take action is also important. Just because an issue is identified in the people part of the system, it doesn't necessarily mean the solution lies in the same place. A hierarchy of controls is a way of thinking about the reliability and sustainability of any action we take. Actions near the top of the hierarchy are more reliable and sustainable. Procedures and training are less reliable and sustainable. And personal protective equipment is a last defense. Through this lens, we see that procedures and training may not be the most effective way to take action. If we can move towards the top of the hierarchy, we can get more reliable controls. Can we eliminate or engineer out potential problems and error traps? Can we provide controls to prevent, detect, and recover from mistakes? Also, it helps to remember that an issue discovered on one vessel is likely to exist on other vessels. So consider applying action across the fleet. Let's look at how we might put some of that into action. Here is an example where an inspector has noticed that on the vessel there was no procedure for notifying vessel defects to class flag or port. Here you see that it has been raised under both the process and human categories. In process, the inspector has identified that the procedure was missing or inadequate. The inspector has gone on to ask the crew about how and when they report defects to class, flag or port, but found no evidence of anyone knowing how and when it was done. The vessel doesn't appear to be doing it. In human, the inspector has observed this to be not as expected, with the performance influencing factor that the procedure was unhelpful or inaccurate. Let's think about how the class approach might apply in this situation. First, choosing to learn, not blame. Here we see that the operator has looked into the issue in quite some detail and has recognized that in fact there has been a breakdown in communication between the shore and the vessel. The company practice is for vessel defects to be notified to class, flag or port by the shore team, not the vessel, but somehow this has not been understood by everybody involved. It would have been very easy to blame the crew in this situation, but the company chose to explore the issue further and discovered the nature of the problem, which helped them come up with solutions. Learn from those who do the work. In this case, the company talks to everybody involved in the notification process and discovers the notifications were usually made onshore. Address PIFs. The PIFs were made healthy by updating the procedure and having the superintendent inform the vessel on which defects were notified to authorities and which weren't. Here, the company has not only addressed the PIF of procedures which were first identified, but also aims to improve the PIF relating to team dynamics and communication coordination. The company has chosen to take action systematically, applying these actions and guidance across the fleet of vessels. Finally, the superintendent is sharing feedback with the vessel, recognizing that they help in revealing the gap and letting them know about the sustainable fixes which will support them to do these tasks better. Now let's revisit the ECDIS example that we viewed earlier. You'll remember that the inspector spotted that satellite positioning wasn't being routinely verified and made an observation that the task was not as expected. Choosing to learn. It would have been easy in this case to assume that the navigator was the problem. In this example, the company chose to have an open mind and try and understand better why verification wasn't being routinely carried out. Learn from those who do the work. The company chose to talk to a number of different navigators and masters to understand why verification wasn't happening. They discovered that navigators believed that verification was only required if they suspected that there was a positioning error on ECDIS. The navigators were keen to have clear guidance on what the preferred verification method should be and how often it should be routinely carried out. Act to improve PIFs. The procedure PIF was turned healthy by introducing a regular verification task using specific methods. The company chose to add another healthy PIF by introducing practice sessions on satellite positioning verification carried out by the superintendent during their visits. Finally, the company shared feedback with the vessel and navigators, thanking them for their assistance in tackling this misunderstood issue. Let's take one last example and revisit the under-keel clearance calculation that we explored earlier. In this case, the inspector found that the task was as expected. Although it's not a requirement to provide an operator comment to an as expected, we can still learn something from this observation. Although an error had been made in the calculation, it had actually been detected and corrected in a systematic way before any consequences were realized. It would have been easy for the company to point the finger of blame because an error had been made, but they realized that even though the task was as expected, there was something important to learn here. Learn from those who do the work. Working with vessels, the company reviewed the guidance that people were using for performing the calculation and found that in some places it was ambiguous and open to interpretation. They also found that few vessels performed the routine cross-checks that the inspected vessel had been using. The company decided to act to improve the PIFs, even though this task had exceeded expectation. The company built error checks into the process and developed some practice scenarios to help people rehearse the under-keel calculations under different circumstances. Finally, the company passed the feedback to the vessel that had been inspected, noting that they were going to be using the vessel's cross-check process in other parts of the business.